Hi, everybody. So Saturn is going retrograde on Saturday, okay? And actually, Saturn rules Saturday. Now, when Saturn is direct, Saturn is the task master of the zodiac. Saturn helps us to stay structured. Saturn helps us to do the right things in the right order at the right time, okay? Saturn helps us to follow instructions, things like that. Saturn is a very disciplined and structured planet. So whenever a planet goes retrograde, it doesn't function at its full capacity. Okay, it's almost like it's taking a nap or it's on vacation. Okay, looking at Mercury, when Mercury is retrograde, Mercury is the planet that deals with your thought pattern, how you process things mentally, communication. So when Mercury is retrograde, Mercury brings us events, like, for example, when Mercury is retrograde, we might tend to forget to send an email. We might forget to call somebody. Our computers start acting up, more than usual when Mercury is retrograde. So when Saturn is retrograde, we will tend to not be as structured wherever Saturn is transiting in our chart. Okay, so for example, let's say in your natal chart, you have Saturn in your 8th house. Okay, someone with Saturn in their natal chart in the 8th house is someone who more than likely has good credit. Okay, because the 8th house can deal with credit and loans and taxes. So if you have Saturn in the 8th house in your natal chart, you will tend to be very structured when it comes to using credit. You know, you'll be structured. You will keep an eye on your credit score and your credit report, things like that. Because Saturn is there. When you were born, that's where Saturn was in your chart. So you might tend to be very structured when it comes to dealing with taxes, credit, things like that. So it also deals with sex. So a lot of people who have Saturn in the 8th house in the natal chart will tend to be very structured when it comes to sex. And I'm looking at it this way. Somebody with Saturn in the 8th house in the natal chart will be the type of person that will ask their partner to get tested more so than someone who doesn't have Saturn there. Okay, someone with Saturn in the 8th house in the natal chart will probably, tell their partner, hey, before we can do this thing, you need to get tested. Let's go get tested together. Things like that. But when Saturn is retrograde, Saturn is more lax. Saturn is more lenient. Saturn is like, okay, while I was direct, I gave you the rules that you need to follow. I'm going to take a break for a while. Which means if Saturn is taking a break, we will be taking a break wherever Saturn is in our chart. Now, when I say taking a break, that could mean looking back at what you've accomplished, what you've done while Saturn was direct, going over some things like what could you be more structured about in your life, things like that. So let's look at Saturn retrograde through the houses. So if Saturn is transiting your 1st house when it goes retrograde, you might tend to be more lax about your appearance, your demeanor, your identity. You might kind of like give yourself a break. If you're the type of person who always wants to look a certain way, when Saturn is retrograde in your 1st house, you might tend to be more lax about your appearance. Okay, Saturn in the 2nd house. If you have Saturn transiting your 2nd house when it goes retrograde on Saturday, you might tend to not be as structured about saving, not as structured about your personal finances, your worth, things like that, okay? You might not be as much of a go-getter when it comes to earning income when Saturn is retrograde in your second house. Now, if you have the transiting Saturn in house 3 when it goes retrograde, you might tend to not be so structured in keeping up communications with your siblings or your neighbors. You might tend to not worry about getting some upgrades on your car because it can deal with transportation, the third house. If you've been editing or doing research on something, you might tend to kind of like give yourself a break and not be so focused on completing the editing or completing the research. You might try to skip steps when Saturn is retrograde in your third house. So when Saturn is retrograde, it is a more lax energy. So we might have to rethink some things, redo some things, just, take everything slowly, because Saturn is not direct to give us a structure that we're used to Saturn giving us. So let's move on. If you have Saturn retrograde in your fourth house, you might tend to deal with your home and family situations in a more relaxed way. Okay, so if something is going on within your home and family dynamics and Saturn is retrograde there, you might tend to let the kids eat more candy or something like that. It's things related to your home and family dynamics that you will be more lax about. Now, if you have Saturn retrograde in your fifth house when it goes retrograde on Saturday, if you're one who has certain ideals about romance, you might tend to kind of like relax those ideals. You might, like let's say, for instance, you have a certain idea of what a romantic evening is for you. You might find yourself just saying, you know what, let's just do Netflix and chill or something like that when Saturn is retrograde. Because when Saturn is retrograde, Saturn is more relaxed. So the things that govern the house where Saturn is located when it goes retrograde on Saturday, you will tend to be more relaxed about those things. Now, moving on to the sixth house. If you have Saturn retrograde in your sixth house when it goes retrograde, you will tend to not worry so much about healthy eating, working out, doing things that are, good for your body, good for your health. You might tend to not worry about sticking to a certain routine every day when Saturn is retrograde. Let's move on to the seventh house. If Saturn is retrograde in your seventh house, then you might tend to be lax about what a partnership is to you, because the seventh house can deal with partnerships. So you might tend to be more lax about contracts. Like if you had a certain standard for contracts that you're in, when Saturn goes retrograde, it's really not a great time to enter contracts because you will be more lax. And you don't want to enter a contract when Saturn is retrograde and you have let some things slide that you normally would not have let slide when Saturn is direct. So if you are entering into any type of contracts when Saturn is retrograde in your seventh house, you might want to maybe hire an additional attorney to review some things for you, since Saturn being retrograde in that area of your chart is going to have you more relaxed and more lax and more lenient. So dealing with partnerships and contracts, things like that, you will be more lax. So moving on to the eighth house. Now, I did cover the eighth house a little bit, at the beginning of this video. But if you have Saturn retrograde in your eighth house, then if you are a very structured in dealing with your credit, you might find yourself being more lenient with yourself on how you access your credit, how much you're using your credit cards. You might find that you might be using your credit cards more, or even if you're not using them more, you might find yourself maybe not paying them off or things like that. And also with sex, you might find yourself being a little bit more lenient on your standards when it comes to sex. So be careful. Keep using protection if you're into that, and things like that. But also, if you have Saturn in your ninth house when it goes retrograde, you will tend to be more relaxed about religion. Like, you might not be so structured when it comes to dealing with spirituality and religion. Your philosophy about things will be more relaxed, lenient, more passive. Saturn retrograde is a more passive energy. Now, if you have Saturn retrograde in your 10th house can deal with career, it can deal with promotion, things like that. If you've been trying to get a promotion and Saturn goes retrograde in your 10th house, you might find yourself feeling like, you know what, I'm not even worried about that promotion right now. If it happens, it happens. I've done everything I need to do. And if I don't get it, I'm not worried about it. So you might find yourself being more relaxed and more, I'm going to say, easier on yourself. When Saturn is retrograde, wherever Saturn is retrograde in your chart, you will tend to be easier on yourself, less hard on yourself, less structured. Now, if Saturn is retrograde in your 11th house, the 11th house can deal with networking, friendships. You will find that you might not be as interested in networking, or you might not be so structured when it comes to hanging out with your friends when Saturn is retrograde. Now, moving on to the 12th house, because the 12th house can deal with the subconscious mind. It can deal with places of confinement. It deals with everything hidden. So Saturn being retrograde there will have you more relaxed about things dealing with secrets and spirituality. Like, things that you normally would have kept to yourself, because Saturn being direct in the 12th house will have you keeping things to yourself, being more structured about secrets, being more structured about prayer, meditation. So you might find yourself being more lax and lenient on yourself if you have Saturn in the 12th house. But overall, I feel like Saturn retrograde is a very good thing, because a lot of people feel like they don't get a break wherever Saturn is located in your chart. And I'm talking about the transiting Saturn now. When I opened up the video, I was talking about Saturn in your natal chart. But these, through the houses that I've been talking about, is the transiting Saturn, because as transiting Saturn moves, the Saturn in your natal chart does not, okay? Even though when Saturn is retrograde, I feel like it's a good thing. It can be a good thing because it kind of gives everybody a break, okay? Because remember, as I mentioned at the beginning, Saturn is a very structured planet. So it helps you to stay structured. And this is summertime. We tend to do more fun things, during summer months. So Saturn being retrograde during a summer month is going to have us a little bit more relaxed, a little bit more lenient, less hard on ourselves. So we can just take it and enjoy it. It is going to have some of us thinking twice about some things, redoing some things, related to wherever Saturn is located. But overall, Saturn retrograde is not a bad thing. Now, as always, you have to look at everything else that is going on in your chart as well. But in general, Saturn retrograde is going to be a more relaxed feeling for a lot of people. I'm not saying for everyone, but for a lot of people, this is going to be a welcomed relief, sort of like a break. A lot of people are glad that Saturn is going retrograde because Saturn is taking a break. And we should also.